Okay. All right, we're back. We're ready. You guys can have a seat. And we're going to get started. So hopefully those that have come late have seen me. I'm Ruth Milligan, just to remind you that those who maybe came late and didn't know. And this is Katie Sasso. Say hi, Katie.
Hi, everybody.
Katie was Reagan's right-hand person last year for this conference, and she's been extremely integral in the WIA team. Come on up. And I just wanted to let Katie introduce herself, but I wanted to also ask a question. So Katie's a data scientist at the Columbus Collaboratory, and I just thought it was really important for people to know what the Collaboratory is before she hosts this panel Q&A. So why don't you give us a chance to learn about the Collaboratory?
Yeah, so I'm a data scientist at the Columbus Collaboratory. It is a company here in Columbus, and it's a pretty unique setup. So we were founded by 7 major companies in Columbus, a lot of them who are here today represented and supporting women in analytics, so thank you. And our mission kind of was to build our collective insight up in cybersecurity, advanced analytics, and the intersection of the two in the Columbus region, and then beyond once we kind of reached our maturity point. So we're in that stage today, and we're working with our members and going beyond those to become a full profit company. So it's a great place to work on all sorts of interesting problems, and I love it.
Great. Wasn't that introduction so much better coming from her than me? So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
So let's welcome Nicole and Emily back to the stage. Katie's going to host a Q&A. She's got a few prompt questions, but I think her goal is to really get you guys to interact with these speakers. So enjoy.
Thanks so much, Ruth.
Come on back.
Thank you. Hi. All right. So like Ruth said, kind of the goal here is actually for not me to ask my questions, but I do have plenty if we hit a lull. But the goal is really to hear from you guys. So after the panel over lunch or just after lunch, I'm hoping you guys have some great questions. So, we have Nicole and Emily here, and I'd love to get a good dialogue going. So any questions at all? We have some mic rovers out in the audience. So we have one right here. We've got another. So we've got Brian, and we've got Ezgi. We've got plenty of rovers here. So raise your hand, and maybe stand up, actually, if you have a question. I think that might be easier for folks to see you. OK, looks like we have our first one.
Hi. So I manage data privacy, and I'm curious how you both manage it in your current landscapes, your current businesses, and from large to small. How do you
actually, that's a good question for me in that I moved into a product lawyer role this fall, and before that I was a privacy specialist on the data privacy legal team for about 4 years. And there is a lot of intersection between privacy and ethics. So is your question more like how the company manages privacy all up?
Both. To be honest, it's, how do you manage it? How do you manage the intersection? And, how does that apply to like a consumer and a customer?
Yeah, so when it comes to privacy, Microsoft has been working on privacy-related issues for a really long time. So we do have a very robust structure, which is probably something that would be difficult to put in place in a smaller organization. But we use a hub-and-spoke model where we have a central privacy governance team that comes up with the policies and standards that roll out throughout the company. But we also have embedded in each business group a person called a privacy manager. And the privacy manager adheres to the policies and guidelines that are coming out from the central group. But they make sure that from a technical perspective, everything is up to speed. So when it comes to, for instance, a new consumer app or service that's being launched, they would have to go through a series of privacy reviews before anything would be able to go out the door. And now, similarly, when it comes to ethics and privacy, they're trying to kind of bake ethics into that review process. So from the ground up, just like security and privacy is now kind of an afterthought, it's baked in from the very beginning. You don't have to worry. Similarly, we're doing that with ethics.
I was going to say, I come at it probably from a slightly different perspective. I don't have one particular company that I work with for privacy, so I have to, from an academic perspective, I have to understand privacy regulations that may be very different from a government level. So GDPR, for instance, or the privacy regulations that just came out for California, or China's new privacy laws and how companies are able to use data in China and transport it across country lines. So for me, I think it's understanding what the regulations are and what they aren't, and where companies need to think about an overlay on top of the regulation if the regulation isn't stringent enough or doesn't necessarily reflect the industry that they're in. So if I'm working with a healthcare client, obviously from a medical perspective, privacy is much more. You have HIPAA regulations in the US, you have data privacy and being able to port your information from country to country. So I think that it's important ethically just to be transparent, particularly with the consumer, about what your privacy policy is, and just making sure that they truly understand it. And a lot of companies don't. Like, a lot of companies bake in privacy into like T&Cs, which we all know no one reads. And I think that it's really, from an ethical perspective, the challenge for organizations is to make sure that your consumer understands what you're doing with their data, how you're leveraging their data, and what are the outcomes of leveraging that data. So.
Yeah, great. It was a great panel. Thank you so much for all your input. So from what I understand, it sounds like we're expecting, the companies to be kind of played the nice guy. At the same time, though, I get the feeling we need some watchdogs that is actually outside and not necessarily in the corporate world, or potentially have stricter regulations. And what really concerns me is that after seeing Facebook in front of the House committee, no one really understands what's going on, or at least for the people who are supposed to be making the policy. Mm-hmm. And we are, even in this room, are talking how difficult it is to balance some of these things. So for me, the concern would be in the future, because AI is moving so fast, it's just out there, technology just keeps moving. And we're still not making any moves, and government is so slow. They're already kind of, easy to be persuaded, maybe with lobbying. What kind of teams would they need? Like, as the citizens, what can we do to push the government, potentially to protect us, at least nudge them somehow? Or what can we do to create these watchdogs that would potentially do something outside of the corporation? I know our center has been what the corporations can do, but what would be the other steps we can potentially take, legally, as well as maybe at the more organizational level?
Well, I think, so I'm going to take that in a couple of different parts. I think one of the important things to realize is, so there's been a slew of data breaches, leaks, et cetera, over the last 18 months, massive ones. And I think the important thing to realize about that is that legislation wouldn't necessarily have stopped that. So those breaches weren't illegal. There were systemic problems on how the breaches happened, but they weren't illegal. And so legislation wouldn't have deterred that from necessarily happening unless regulation gets so specific, saying when you have to put patches in, do updates, encryption levels, et cetera. So I think the important thing to think about is understanding, having legislation in place obviously is definitely important, but it's not a win-all. So it's also about making sure that companies are cognizant of, what do I need to do for my particular industry with the threat levels that I face, et cetera, in order to make sure that my consumers' data is safe. For average individuals, I would say there's so many watchdog groups out there. I mean, we could probably give a list of like 100 different organizations that are actively, getting in front of Congress and having oversight with companies and championing them to change their ways and embed all kinds of different levels of oversight. I think the average person, I always tell my students, first and foremost, be aware of, and you don't have to be an attorney, but be aware of how companies are using your information. And sometimes that's just as simple as asking the question. particularly just saying that you want to opt out or you don't want your information held in a database. And that's something that every individual is able to do. You contact a company, you say that you want them to delete your information from the system. So it's different than GDPR, where the right to be forgotten is embedded within the legislation. But here in the US, you can also have that body set up of, I just don't want to be in your system. I think it's important to know how your data is being used, where your data actually resides, which can be extremely cumbersome. But again, if it's your information, your personally identifiable information, I also argue that as individuals, it's also to a certain extent up to us to make sure that our information is secure and make sure that we know who has access to it. So.
Yeah, and just to follow on some of what you were saying, Nicole, I think there are a lot of watchdog groups out there already that are having an impact, and they are definitely having a really good impact with companies as well as with the legislators. And there's incredibly active conversations right now going on in state legislatures, particularly, about how all of these things play out. So though I definitely do agree that it's challenging to get things done in the federal government right now, we can rely on state AGs and state legislatures to really affect change. And just, I mean, I'm not saying that I particularly agree with all aspects of the California Privacy Act that just passed, but it is a showcase of how one individual saw a problem and was able to move forward and move the ball forward to actually create a new privacy law in the state of California. And other states have picked that up. And so, you know, I would definitely challenge you to think about how you can act locally and then maybe think through how that can play out more broadly.
We have a question over here.
Hi, we're here with a small city, so I know a lot of this is more the corporate side and all, and internal data and whatnot, but I'm wondering if you can speak, either of you, a little bit to sort of public-facing data and how to maybe best protect certain data, how to, you know, how do you choose what data is best for the public, how to visualize, just any input you have, really, because we're looking to kind of start an open data portal in our city right now.
That's a great question. It's always interesting because obviously more data, making data accessible is the crux of it. So making sure that you have access to huge data sets in order to make informed decisions. So there are a lot of cities, and I work more with China making data accessible on a province level than I have in cities here in the US. But I do know that it really starts with, you know, championing your county, your city, to make sure that they have like an open.gov system. And then obviously having those systems linked together so that you can pull from multiple cities and multiple states. Obviously the federal government here in the US has actually a lot of, well, I think it's changed over the last administration. So, but they historically did have a lot of data publicly available, particularly at the federal level. It's a little bit easier, I guess I would say maybe in China from the work I've done, only because the Chinese government has said this is a major, something that we want everyone to have access to. So data is a public domain. Sometimes privacy concerns aside, but data is a part of the public domain. And then you have the different provinces and cities that are really aggressively championing, you know, having open data sets, and there's just streams of information that's readily available, sometimes too much, which is personally identifiable, which is obviously problematic. So it's kind of two separate issues. China, you can have more than enough data and you want it to be anonymized, whereas here in the US, you have cities that are trying to aggregate and get data readily available, but it's also the cleaning process, it's issues around privacy, and it's also making sure that the data is truly anonymized and you can't back it out and make it personally identifiable here in the US by connecting multiple data sources. So it's a little tricky, but I would say definitely going to your state and local officials just to advocate at usually the open door sessions that they have.
I would also, I know at least in Seattle, they have a really large open data initiative right now. And the city of Seattle has actually created a whole bureau that's dedicated to that. So I would ask you if you've looked at other cities that have started down that path. And rather than reinventing the wheel, can you draft off of what other cities have done? I would imagine that they would be hugely supportive of trying to have other cities step into their shoes and follow their practices. So I would look around and see what other cities have done.
And I do know that New York State is very good too with sharing data, particularly the city, and they have relatively open data across at least the 5 boroughs for New York City. So that might also be a good place to start.
Sorry, I can't stand up. Oh, that was really loud. So, based on your guys' discussion, it seems like all data scientists at some point have to be ethicists. So, what do you say to somebody who is like, I don't care, I just want to go do cool things with data, code, and like move on with my life? Like, does every single person have to have this ethics background in order to be an effective data scientist?
So that's an excellent question. I don't necessarily think that every data scientist has to be an ethicist, but I do think that they have to be mindful about the potential impact of what it is that they're building on whatever context it's being deployed in. So similar to what Kathy spoke to today, I definitely agree with her that not only is it important to really get the coding of the algorithm right, but it's also important to get a better understanding of where that's going. So to the extent you're asking, you know, what would you want to tell somebody who might have that message of, I just want to do my 9 to 5 and then go home, that 9 to 5 is incredibly important when it comes to things that are going to have potentially a meaningful impact on the humans around them. So context is crucial. If you're dealing with things where somebody's creating algorithms that are going to decide whether somebody gets credit or insurance, or like Nicole said earlier, whether they get into college, those are really important decisions. And to the extent the math and coding that you're doing is going to decide that, then you have to have some responsibility for that.
And I don't know, that's a tricky question because I don't want to put too much emphasis on the data scientist, right? I mean, you're hired for a job, and you obviously want to do that job to the best of your ability, and there's a creativity and a curiosity there. But you can't always think about the ramifications down the road, right? You know, I think back to when I was in high school and I worked at like an ice cream shop, right? I never thought about, you know, diabetes. Like I'm feeding the population the fattiest thing I can possibly feed them. So, I mean, you have to, at a certain extent, kind of say, when is someone doing their job and when do they have to think about all of the potential outcomes of a product that they've developed? So I want to be careful not to put too much weight on the data scientist or the analyst. But I do think that more so what a data scientist can have an effect on is the organization you choose to work with, is the company and the voice that you have within that company. And it's very tricky. You go in, you work for Google, you work for Microsoft, let's say, large tech company. At the time, they may not be doing any work with government entities or individuals that you may disagree with as a data scientist. And then they get a contract, and you know, as Google and Microsoft employees have done, they made their voices heard, saying this is not something that we agree with. We don't want to work for an organization that, you know, helps or sells products to X, Y, and Z. So I think it's important to be able to articulate your voice in your company. But again, you can't always have the foresight to know, I've developed this amazing algorithm. In one instance, it could, you know, help prevent heart disease, or it could forecast and understand when individuals are going to have a heart attack. In another context, it could be used for mass surveillance, or it could be used for weaponizing targets in another country. So it's not necessarily the algorithm. It's, again, I feel like the outcome of what the algorithm is used for, based on the context of the individuals that procure it. So I feel like there's a lot of weight to put on a data scientist.
Yeah, and I'll actually follow on that. I mean, your point is well taken, and I guess it kind of goes back to what I was speaking to earlier today, which is essentially that engineers, data scientists, they can't do this on their own. And lawyers and compliance leaders and ethicists and industry and government stakeholders, end users, everybody has a role to play here. To the extent you can help affect an interdisciplinary approach in your organization, that would help take some of the onus off of each individual to do things on their own.
Hello again. So I have a question about getting good data, I guess. So, you know, a good analysis of bad data is a bad analysis. So as far as obtaining good data and also cleaning data, what are your thoughts on that?
So obtaining the data, that's always tricky. It's so funny because everyone says, oh, there's a huge amount of data. Data is so accessible. I'm like, no, it's not. I worked for Nielsen. I know how much we charge for our data. So I think it's interesting. To procure data is very difficult, and that's one of the biggest, I think, hiccups when it comes to really working in a data lake that's representative, and being able to eliminate some of the issues that we see. I think that obviously using available data, open source data is amazing, but it's also being able to aggregate multiple sources together. And sometimes it's worthwhile to do primary data. Sometimes it's worthwhile to cut a check and get data that's already been cleaned and managed and is being used. And I guess it just depends on the scope of the work that you're conducting. The cleaning piece is, I've had analysts work for me and econometricians. I don't clean data myself, but they always said that's the bane of their existence. So I know it's a difficult process. I would say this from just a step-by-step process. You should ensure that there are multiple individuals cleaning the data with a slightly different eye on it. Because if you're cleaning the data to make sure that it's harmonized, that's one element. If you're cleaning the data then to make sure that it is representative, that to me is a slightly different skill set. And it's a slightly different approach to what you're focusing on and what your job is. And I think most companies, particularly huge market research firms, or even consulting firms, they all look at data in phases. And you have different individuals looking at the data from different perspectives. And it goes back to that interdisciplinary approach to make sure that if I'm developing a data lake for healthcare, that I don't just have data scientists looking at the data, but I also have individuals within the healthcare field to really ensure that the data makes sense within the context that it's being collected for.
Yeah, so I told you earlier, I cannot code. I've never coded. It's not my thing, but I can speak more to the first part of your question on obtaining data, because that is something, as a lawyer, I do a lot in my day job, and thinking deeply with my clients about asking the questions about where it is that they've obtained data. Do they know that the person that collected the data initially had the proper consents? Do they have visibility into whether that data set has biases in it? Have they checked that? So I think I think we just keep kind of emphasizing the same thing, but making sure you're getting a wide variety of perspectives and really asking yourself the hard question and stopping and thinking, even when you're stretched thin and you may not really have a chance to think about anything that is not critical, you still should make an effort to embed that into your daily practices.
Hi. So I have a question about if there's a new machine learning algorithms trying to be deployed in a company's settings. And it's new to compliance, to legal departments as well. It's more for Emily. What kind of community and resources you would recommend me to bring back to the teams so that they know what's the best practice? They can share what's good, what's not.
Yeah, so just to reiterate your question, you're asking about whether or not we have best practices that we're bringing back into the teams?
Yes, and share kind of across companies, like what compliance and the legal departments can do or can research.
Yeah, so we do have the benefit at Microsoft of being such a large company that we are heavily resourced to have these amazing researchers who, for their full-time job, are thinking about just those questions. And right now, we have a number of people that are working on toolkits, for instance, to try to roll out both internally and externally to help teach people what it is that they should be doing from a technical perspective. But you have to pair that also with governance. So if your question is more like the best practices and how we message that to people, I think we have this tops-down and bottoms-up approach where each individual team is trying to kind of snap to our overall company standards. And there are some things that probably will be coming out in the coming weeks that I can't speak to today about the ways in which we're going to be kind of upping the ante on our governance internally. When it comes to smaller companies that are not as well resourced, I would actually challenge you to also think about ways in which your smaller size or the lack of history is probably an advantage in some respects, because one of the things that we've also had to do a lot of is rejigger years of legacy code in order to try to make things better. But if you have an opportunity as a best practice to start from the bottom up, to build responsible AI into your practices, that is hugely important and really impactful.
So speaking of different kinds of companies, you mentioned insurance and loans and these kind of areas where there's a lot of focus on making fair and just decisions. Do you feel like there's an industry or I guess type of business, maybe startups, or do you feel like there's a space that's really missing the boat? And one could argue perhaps maybe even in the insurance and banking space, there are still unfair practices. But the fact is they do have regulations they have to go through for anything that makes a decision, that impacts somebody's loan that they're able to get. So do you feel like there's an industry or area that's just kind of missing the mark entirely, or that's very kind of prone to serious problems right now?
I'm going to go with the one that I feel doesn't have the level of oversight that it should, and that it has the largest impact on the population, and that's law enforcement. And that's where I see it the most. I see that it's law enforcement doesn't have the overarching, you could say it's the justice system, but we, particularly in the US, have seen that there's a lot of discrepancies in, when you think about recidivism, algorithms, when you think about just the difference in overall sentencing of individuals for the same crime, right, across state lines, based on socioeconomic backgrounds. That's probably one of the areas that I would like there to be more foresight, more analysis in when you implement. What's the KPI? What's the outcome that you're looking for when you're bringing facial recognition in, or when you're bringing in algorithms in order to see if somebody has the potential for recidivism, or when you think about even allocating police to particular areas. And I think that in and of itself has an effect on already vulnerable populations, and it's only magnified with some of the things that we've seen executed over the last 18 months. So whereas when you think of health, finance, there are very specific regulations that that have oversight. So they can only go so far to a certain extent outside of the confines of what they're legally allowed to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know that I would say that there's any particular industry that's completely missing the mark. I do think it's harder in scenarios where you're going to have like a meaningful impact on somebody versus I don't necessarily think that targeted advertising has it all right, for instance. But I do think, the impact, the potential impact of the ad that you're being served is different from the potential impact of a facial recognition system that might misidentify you. So I think everybody has work to do. I just think that the impacts are different.
I would say the one industry that I'd like to see more caution as they move forward would be the health industry, particularly when you think about predictive algorithms and really having an effect, because it could really benefit the population as a whole, right? Making sure that you identify individuals who could have cancer later on in life or have a heart attack later on in life, and really making sure that privacy concerns are taken into account there, but at the same time that you're using it equally across the population to benefit the population as a whole versus select groups of individuals. So.
Yeah, and I want to make sure also, like, we don't come off completely as downers up here because I think we should all also think about all of the potential that AI has to do good. And I think that's something that can easily be overlooked in some of the dystopian pictures that we're painting here, and all of you can really play a role in ensuring that that happens. So that's just another thing to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
We have another audience question or two here.
So just with what you were just speaking about, it kind of prompted a question in my head, which is, do you feel that the big companies are going to lead the way in the AI movement, or do you feel like there's small startups that, even if they have less funding, are still going to be able to like kind of move the needle or offer up, really unique ways of this new revolution, I guess?
I think we'll have to wait and see what happens in a lot of respects. But I think the large companies do have some advantages in the amount of data that they have. I know with Microsoft, what's super interesting is, most of the volume of business that we do is actually with our enterprise customers. And we don't do it. We do have consumer-facing products and services, but it really isn't as much of the big portion of our business. And because of that, some of the advantages that like a Facebook or an Amazon or companies that have more of a consumer database have are a little bit different for us because we put very tight limits on what it is that we'll do with our customers' data, both contractually and then even above and beyond that. So I think maybe it depends on what business these startups are in, but having access to those vast amounts of data does give larger companies a lot of a leg up in where things are headed.
Yeah, I would actually argue that I think, I'm biased obviously, but I think academia is really prone on being able to change the game moving forward, particularly because you see folks like NYU, MIT, developing completely new colleges of interdisciplinary. So it's not just data scientists, but it's really pairing data science with the humanities and looking at sort of AI from a very different perspective than what we've historically looked at it through the lens that we've historically looked at it. And I think the great thing about being in academia, whereas being in a company, you're like Microsoft, so you don't have access to Google data, right? Microsoft has access to huge amounts of data, but it's their clients' data or it's their own data. Google's the same. A startup only has access to so much information. The great thing about being in academia is because we're academics and it's all about developing insights and research, is that we get access to just data across the board. So we have access to Microsoft data, not all of the amazing stuff, but I'll argue for a little bit more. But access to Microsoft, access to Google, access to government data. So I feel as though if change could be made immediately, it'd be great for the big tech companies to do that. But I do think that within academia, we have the opportunity to be sort of the impartial individual in the conversation to really lead that forward, and starting with educating the next generation of individuals who will be moving into these companies and making them think differently, and challenging sort of that mindset of when you're entering the industry as a whole. How do you think about developing AI? How do you think about deploying AI? What are the questions you're asking? Is it interdisciplinary? So I would say it'd be great if tech companies did it. It'd be great if governments did it. It'd be great if startups did it. But I think academia has the opportunity to really make a difference.
Yeah. We all have a good opportunity right now, because we are certainly at an inflection point in where things are heading. And it's an important time for us to reflect on those questions. So that is one that I'll probably still noodle on, but it's a good one.
So I work for a very large company. So how do you avoid taking the cost of data analytics and passing it on to the consumer?
That is a very good question also. I mean, sometimes it has to be, there are things that we have to invest in, but I think a lot of it has to do with making sure that internally people are understanding the importance of these things that you're trying to do. And I don't know about you if you're working in privacy, but one thing that we've dealt with over the years at Microsoft is, for a long time, privacy was viewed as more of a tax. And so when you're coming to developing new products and services, there wasn't a lot of appetite from the top to support more resources for privacy to make sure that things were buttoned up in the way that we wanted them to be, because it costs a lot of money. Ultimately, the laws came to play a big role in the amount of resources that are now really crucial to ensuring that we are getting it right from the ground up. And I think similarly, in this space, if there's a mindset shift, and you can do kind of what I was talking about earlier today, which is like embed these values both from the bottom up and from the top down, that's really, I think, where things start to shift. So I don't know that it's necessarily avoid passing the costs on to the consumers as much as it is try to ensure that people really understand the value, and even the consumers that might be getting something that has been developed in an ethical way and a compliant way. Maybe there's added value in that they would be willing to pay for.
And also, I just think the costs are I think the costs within an organization should be held in the operations sector. That's a personal opinion. But also, again, if you're a large company, particularly if you're an MNC now, and in any way, shape, or form, if you're doing work with individuals or individuals whose data is from the EU, then technically you've already embedded that cost in your operations, because now you're required to have a CPO. So some of the costs have been mandated for large companies. So it should be at least 2019, 2020 embedded in the operations for the P&L.
So how do you guys think that kind of us as a society should prepare for this kind of looming age of automation and potentially wiping out a lot of low skill jobs or maybe even some high skill jobs. And then how do you think data scientists who are deploying these types of tools should be thinking about, what kind of impact they can actually have on the economy or, the greater working population?
So I think we have challenges and we also have opportunities here. And something that we've been talking about since we started coming up with these this AI framework, thinking about privacy still, is essentially that we can use AI to augment human capabilities, and we're not trying to design AI to replace people. This is responsible human-centered AI, but it's not designed to completely make people useless. So something that we think is really important at this point is to focus on education of individuals who might have those low-skilled jobs that you're thinking about right now, and trying to figure out ways in which we can skill them up to take on new roles in an economy that's going to shift. And again, I mean, we've had these shifts before. This is what they're calling the fourth industrial revolution. We've dealt with industrial revolutions before, and there's definitely problems when it comes to people that had low-skilled labor that was basically replaced by, horses. There were people that were taking care of horses long before there were cars, and then all of a sudden they were out of a job, right? These things are important, and they are really hard, and it's going to be a long journey, I think, for sure, but I do think it's both an opportunity and a challenge.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, with automation, it's always interesting because, I mean, we think about individuals being massively unemployed because we have, this next age of automation. But they will be doing jobs that we can't even fathom today. I was going to say my mother, let alone my grandmother. My mother would never have thought that somebody would have a job as a search engine marketing specialist. She's like, what is that? What's search, number one? Why do you need a specialist? I mean, there were jobs that, a decade ago, 2 decades ago, we couldn't even think would be an opportunity. So when it comes to automation, yes, there are going to be jobs that are no longer needed because automation comes into play. But there's also going to be a huge amount of jobs that, again, we can't even think of today because they don't currently exist. But we're going to have a need for them in a decade or 2 decades.
We probably have time for one more question. Anybody out there? Any additional questions?
I have another question. I actually want to follow up on the leak comment that you made. I think it's perfectly reasonable. And I was just wondering if you guys, or what you're thinking, if a company, for example, is attacked, they have the leak, should the company be fined for something like that? Or, for example, how can we hold them accountable in some sense, so that it doesn't just be like, yeah, we shrug our shoulders and it happened. I know it's actually a PR nightmare probably for them, but at the same time, should they be, fined even more? It's even like with the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. Like, of course, it's a nightmare for them right now, but should be something else. Like, should be something on top of that.
It is definitely something that is burgeoning right now, and Microsoft has been very vocal in trying to argue of the importance for having laws and regulations, particularly in areas like facial recognition, where I think there are some spaces where companies would argue that they can define accountability for themselves, and principles are there to guide them, and they can probably do the hard work to get things done. But there are probably some areas where those mistakes are going to have major impacts on society and people, and those are the areas where I would argue probably we need to have laws in place and regulations in place, and whether that means fines or some other kind of punishment, then yes, I think that is necessary.
Absolutely. So first of all, depending on the leak or how it took place, et cetera, companies are currently fined when there's massive data breaches, depending on if they could have prevented that data breach and there was a lack of effort on the company's behalf. But I think it's also from a regulation perspective, we see companies get fined every day. You know, Google was just fined something like $3 billion. They wrote a check and walked away because it doesn't affect their bottom line really substantially. It doesn't shake their stockholders to the core. Right? And that's one of the reasons why GDPR, for instance, has such a high threshold of how much an organization has to pay if they violate the regulations. So it's really, I think about, you know, I always go back to New York City when you think about a parking fine, right? It's $100 in New York City. $100 is a lot of money to most people still. But if all of a sudden, you know, alternate side parking, the ticket was $500, nobody's no one's gonna like pay a $500 ticket. So it's much more effective because you've increased the penalty. So companies really have to, obviously there should be regulation in place, but you also have to make sure that there's a strong deterrent in order for organizations to be proactive because it really shakes their stockholders to the core. And I think that's where we need to shift the level of responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely some challenges, especially when it comes to the European privacy law, GDPR, that Nicole is referring to, in that there are fines that we're not really sure how they will be implemented yet because there have only been a couple instances thus far where we've seen fines. But you also have to have the resources for the regulators to actually be able to dole out those fines. So it comes with a lot of challenges, but I think regulation is definitely something that we'll need to see in the future in certain spaces.
All right. Well, we are so thankful for you guys coming and kind of spending your time with us today. So give us a big round of applause for the panelists.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And thank you guys for all the great questions. We're going to roll right into some awards announcements and then our final keynote of the day.
So we're going to do awards at 4:10. So you have a quick bio break, but please be back here at 4:10. And thank you all again for joining us. 4:10.